welcome you here to Gonzaga University, whether in person here in the Hemmingson Auditorium or at home live streaming. We had many hundreds of people register for the event, and I think we have a full house tonight, and we probably have about 2 or 3 times this many at home, which is wonderful, zooming in, live streaming from all over the world. So welcome wherever you are. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Gonzaga University resides on the ancestral homelands of the Spokane tribal people, and if it were not for them and other indigenous communities inviting us to this region, then Gonzaga University would not exist as an institution, since we were invited here to start a school by those tribes, and we have much to thank them for and look to them as how to be good stewards of this space and this place. Before we get started with our event, I wanted to bring attention to the fact that we have 2 more events this semester. Both of these are Zoom events, and so you can go to our website at gonzaga.edu/climate center events or scan this QR and register for these free events that'll be on Zoom. The first is with Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray, who's the chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Humboldt State University. She'll be talking about the emotional life of the climate justice movement, talking about the emotional toll that it takes to do this work. And then finally, our last event of this semester will be with Dr. John Abatsoglu, who is a scientist at the University of California, Merced, who will be talking about the credibility of climate models. So we hope that you consider registering for both of those events. And now to introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening, I'd like to bring up to the podium my colleague, Associate Professor of Biology and Environmental Studies, Dr. Betsy Bancroft.
Hello. I am very excited to introduce Dr. Laura Patesh, who is a very talented marine ecologist. Any of you who are interested in marine systems, I'm sure she'd be happy to chat about that. She got her undergraduate degree at Cornell in marine science, marine biology. Her graduate degree was from Oregon State in the Department of Zoology. She did a postdoctoral fellowship at Florida State University at their marine lab, and then went on to do a fellowship with AAAS in DC, working for NOAA, and that led her down several different paths that she may talk about tonight. And now she's currently working in the White House, and I'll let her talk about that. Welcome, Laura.
There you go. What's that? Is it? Yeah. Oh, it sure is. I knew that. And that's the conclusion. So now you're going to read the end of the book first. Okay. Apologies.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Is this okay? All right.
Might do a little closer.
Okay.
Sorry.
No
Get
problem.
right in there.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thanks to the center, and thanks for those nice introductions. Dr. Bancroft happens to be my best friend in the whole wide world, so it's an extra privilege and delight to be here in Spokane with her and with all of you today. So I'm going to be talking about integrating science into climate and environmental policy today, mostly through anecdotes of my experience and my career, which I thought would make it a little less boring than just giving a super dry policy lecture, hopefully. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 different deep dives I've had in connecting science and policy. My postdoc work on drought impacts on an oyster fishery, some work I've done at NOAA on coastal zone management, and then some of the work that I'm doing now at the White House on climate adaptation and resilience policy. So I probably don't need to tell this audience that climate change is happening. It's really bad. It's happening more quickly than was predicted, and the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report was a report of superlatives like highest, fastest, lowest, unprecedented. I mean, it's basically just an extremely depressing tome of really bad things that are happening around the world, including in the United States. And it can be really easy to get depressed when you read a lot of climate reports. But I think it's an important reminder that we climate change is affecting us all, but we also have the ability to do something about it. And that's what I'm trying to do, and I know what a number of you are interested in doing as well. So this is a figure from the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which is a report that my office oversees, and it's really like the most comprehensive report on climate impacts in the United States. Other countries look to this as a model for how to do climate assessments. And you can see that this is just a figure showing rates of temperature change in the US over about a 120-year time period. And while it's uneven, the vast majority of the country has been affected by climate change, including rapid climate change, especially in areas like Alaska, Southern California, and the Northeast, but other areas as well. And this means that heat waves have become more frequent. I saw that Spokane is one of the pilot communities for the extreme heat project, which is actually overseen by one of the offices I've worked at NOAA, so I'm super excited about that. And cold waves are becoming less frequent, and this has implications for people, it has implications for critters, it has implications for infrastructure and the economy, and annual average temperatures will continue to rise in the future. This is an image from NOAA showing the billion-dollar weather and climate disasters just from 2021. So, it's so crowded and chaotic to look at this slide. There were 20 individual events that each had $1 billion or more of damage in that 1 year alone. And of course, this year, we've already seen Typhoon Merbok and the impacts on Alaskan coastal communities. We've seen wildfires, we've seen Hurricane Fiona, and then most recently Hurricane Ian, which I believe is estimated to be the second costliest disaster in the United States next to Katrina. So anyway, we need to do something about this, right? And you all are in the West, so fire is obviously a huge issue and will continue to be a challenge moving ahead. And importantly today, I just want to emphasize that the choices we make really matter. The choices that we make today really matter. We need to mitigate, and that's reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases or remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. We need to adapt, which is reduce the risks from today's changed climate and prepare for future impacts. And basically, one of my former mentors used to say, we need to mitigate, adapt, or suffer the consequences. So the more we do of these two, the less we suffer the consequences. And the sooner and the more aggressively we do these two, the less we suffer the consequences. So the future impacts and risks from climate change are directly tied to the decisions that are made in the present. This is a little bit about my path so far. You heard some of this from Dr. Bancroft. There I am over on the left-hand side as a young undergrad enthusiastically doing coral reef research in the Caribbean. And that was really an amazing experience. I loved doing undergrad research, studying coral diseases. I then did rocky intertidal biology, looking at temperature stress and the effects on mussels. And that's where I met Dr. Bancroft. That was also a really amazing graduate experience. I then went on to do a postdoc at the Florida State Coastal and Marine Laboratory, which is in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then made the transition into the policy environment, working at the NOAA Climate Program Office as a fellow and then a federal employee. I did a 3-year rotational assignment to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I then went back to NOAA and worked in the Office for Coastal Management, and now I'm back in this White House office. So I've done a lot of bouncing around, but have continued to work on climate, coastal, and environmental issues. Beau Obama came to our holiday party one year, which was pretty awesome. So that was a very exciting celebrity sighting for me. Okay. So when I was a postdoc in Florida, there was a major drought happening in the southeast. And Georgia and Alabama and Florida were fighting over water, which they continue to do today. I don't know if anyone here is from the region. But this has been going on for decades, and it's becoming more and more acute as drought becomes more of an issue and population growth continues to increase, especially in Georgia. So this watershed is called the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint River Basin. And it starts in Georgia, it goes through Georgia and Alabama, and then down through the Florida Panhandle. And what was happening was that water levels in Lake Lanier, so that's the picture on top, were really, really low, boats in the water, docks out of the water. Water use is needed for Atlanta. That's a huge metropolitan area. And then agriculturally in the middle of the watershed. And so by the time you get to Florida, the water was just basically like not coming down there. And so there is an oyster fishery there in Apalachicola Bay that at the time provided 90% of the oysters for the state of Florida and 10% of the oysters for the whole United States. So it's a really commercially important industry where they use very sustainable methods. They don't dredge for oysters. They use these hand tongs, which are like iron rakes on the end of long wooden handles. They're really hard. Those guys are so strong. I used to do tonging for my research, and it's like, anyway, you have to get really good biceps. It's a good workout. So anyway, this was happening, and I was down there, and I was interested in the impacts of the drought on salinity, the salt, how much salt water versus fresh water is in the bay, and what that was doing to the oysters because they were seeing all these declines. And so I was out there on the water. The bay also has a National Estuarine Research Reserve, so that's run as a partnership between NOAA and the state of Florida. So they monitor temperature, they monitor salinity and pH, and that's great because they have long-term data sets going back decades. And then I would go out on the water with people from the reserve who were doing also long-term research on oysters. And then I would come back to the lab and do tank experiments looking at temperature and salinity and how that was affecting oysters. And what I found, not surprisingly, because it was the same thing that the fishers were finding, was that there was really high mortality of oysters in high salinity, high temperature water. So that was due both to disease, a disease called dermo that was killing them. And also I did some predator-prey experiments because there are predators that normally would be prevented from hanging out in the estuary because they don't like fresh water. But when the fresh water stops flowing, they're just like, nom, 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 nom. They come in and they eat up all the oysters, and then nothing is kind of keeping their populations back. So anyway, I felt kind of powerless as a scientist who was like doing all this research. I knew what was happening, and I knew what thresholds could be used to inform water management, but it wasn't like me as a postdoc at this one lab was going to like fix the water wars of Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. And so I started, it also just felt weird, and I don't know if you all will have this experience, but like being out on the water doing research and not engaging with the harvesters who were out there making, a living. And so I started talking to them. I started talking to the seafood processing plants and other people like that, and just trying to get a better understanding of like what their observations were, and also just how I could be helpful as an individual to them. So I started volunteering as a science advisor. And so, I would explain what I knew based on the science, and then I would say, what do you know? Tell me more about what you're observing. And some of these people had generations of harvesters, and so, going back 100 plus years. And that was a really powerful and interesting partnership. And it kind of made me want to do more of that. Like it made me feel more useful, even though I was kind of fundamentally powerless. It made me feel more useful to directly engage with people who were being affected by what I was working on. And in the background, there was just like nonstop chaos in the media. So everybody was pointing fingers, right? Georgia was saying like, all that there is in Florida is a few endangered mussels or clams, and why do we care about that when babies in Atlanta don't have enough water to drink? Like there was just all this crazy rhetoric. And in fact, they had, the governor of Georgia had a prayer meeting for rain on the Capitol steps, and then the Tallahassee Democrat published a political cartoon where it's raining low-flow toilets. So, there was just a lot of like jabbing happening. And so, but the reality again was that everybody was suffering from lack of fresh water. And so I, on a whim, met some people at a conference who were doing this program called the AAAS Policy Fellowship. And AAAS is the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They publish Science Magazine. They're a very reputable professional society. And they have a program where they bring PhD scientists and engineers and doctors to DC, and they just throw you in the deep end, which is kind of a crazy experiment, but it's been extremely successful. And now thousands of people have been through this program and either go back to academia or stay in government or work for a nonprofit or do consulting or whatever. And you can work in the executive branch, like I did, or on the Hill, or even in the judiciary branch now. If you all are interested in policy fellowships, there's also opportunities for undergrads through other programs or master's students. So like, you don't have to have a PhD to do, you do to do this, but not to do other policy fellowships. And so this was my cohort, and it was just really incredible to meet people from all over. It was the beginning of the Obama administration, so there was like a lot of excitement around climate and ocean and coast and environment and all things that I really cared about. So I was super psyched to be coming in at that time. And I remember having breakfast with this guy, and he asked me what I did, and I was like, oh, I work on oysters and blah, blah, blah. And then I said, what do you do? And he said, I make bionic eyes for the blind. And I was like, okay. So it was humbling, right? Really cool experience. And really helps scientists understand key decision needs that people are wrestling with in government. So I was really fortunate that there was so you go and you interview in a bunch of different offices, and then you try to like mutually match with someone. And there was an opening at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So this is the agency that has the National Weather Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, we have an ocean service. And this is like my jam. Like I was like, yes, climate and ocean, and that's all the stuff I care about. And at the time, the NOAA Climate Program Office, which is the office running the big heat campaigning thing that Spokane is participating in, was filled with a bunch of brilliant people who were mostly either like physical climate scientists working on global climate modeling or climate research, or social scientists and economists. They didn't actually have any ecologists. And so they're like, we need someone to be our ecologist. And I was like, me? I was like, I've never worked in government. I had like a major imposter syndrome moment. And then I thought about it, and I was like, yeah, like that I can do this. I should do this. This is where my career has been leading me. I've worked with the National History and Research Reserve. I worked in a National Marine Sanctuary in the Florida Keys when I was an undergrad. And so I just was like, this is what I'm gonna do. This is a perfect fit for me. And so I did my fellowship there for a couple of years and was hired on as a federal employee to be their ecosystem science advisor. And so in that role, I created a lot of partnerships across NOAA, including with the National Estuarine Research Reserve. So I set up a climate vulnerability assessment program where they could like look at the vulnerability of the reserves to climate change. I worked with the sanctuaries on a climate smart sanctuary initiative. And then I worked with other federal agencies because President Obama had a climate action plan and was working to get all the agencies to enhance their resilience to climate change. And our office was trying to figure out how to give them the best science to be able to do that. So this was like an incredible opportunity, an entree into federal government for me, where the timing was just really good and the particular placement was really great. That being said, I also had friends who did something like totally different and had a similarly amazing experience. Like my housemate was an expert on rodent neurobiology and then ended up running the president's program for AIDS and HIV in Malawi. So, it's fun to mix it up sometimes. And then coincidentally, while I was there, so the drought continued to be an issue in the Apalachicola watershed. And it was the driest 24 months on record since 1895 for the middle of the watershed. And what happened was the oysters were just like tanking. And it turns out that fisheries in the United States can petition to the Department of Commerce, where NOAA sits, for a disaster declaration. And that provides like financial relief to the harvesters so that they have temporary income while they can't harvest if their resource is being affected. And so through the grapevine, people knew that I had worked in this watershed. And so they were like, hey, Laura, want to help assess this disaster declaration and see if it's valid or not. And I was like, okay. So I actually I hadn't done science in a while. I started making some figures and doing data analysis. And it was fun to nerd out on this watershed again. I looked at the reserve data. And I found that my conclusion was that the drought was very much affecting these declines because the salinity was sky high and, they just can't tolerate levels that high. So that was my assessment. Other people provided some input. And at the end of the day, Commerce granted them the declaration. And so, they had enough money to feed their families. And that was like a very impactful moment for me where I was like, I'm actually using my knowledge to inform something in the real world. I mostly include this because I find it amusing. Like, years later, I found out that a Supreme Court case of Florida versus Georgia actually cited my findings. They were like, Laura Petesh from the NOAA Climate, whatever. And I was like, that's really crazy. Like, it was a very bizarre moment to see something that I just did at my desk, ending up being in a Supreme Court testimony. So I don't, these like water wars are not going away anytime soon. So it's not like I fixed the crisis, but again, just at least like bringing science to the table to inform the response, it was very meaningful to me. The super depressing reality is that this region has now been affected by other disasters. So the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, it didn't actually reach them, but they thought it was going to. And so they said, go ahead and harvest. And so they went out and they harvested. And so the oysters went, the few oysters remaining went down even more. Drought continued to be a problem, so the oysters couldn't come back. And then there was Hurricane Michael, and this is what the downtown area looked like. So these are like the seafood packing plants. And there's also been competition from aquaculture. And so there basically is no oyster industry anymore. Like, it just doesn't exist. And so this part makes me want to cry. But it's like, what is this place without an oyster industry? It's just a totally different place, right? And so, our identity and the sense of place we have, and like, I think we've all had stories like this where places that we love or vacation or, care about or grew up are fundamentally changing in ways that you're like, is that even recognizable to me anywhere? And so I went back there a couple of years ago, and just not seeing any boats on the water was the creepiest feeling I've ever had. It was just like, I don't even know this place anymore. And they serve oysters in the restaurants there, but they're coming from Louisiana. They're not Apalachicola oysters, and they might put a label on it that says like packaged there, but it's just a totally different, right? And so I think, again, as we go through climate change, just thinking about like how much loss we're willing to tolerate as a society, and just how many places across the country have similar stories to this, it just really makes me reflect. So I did a 3-year stint in the Obama White House that I'm actually not going to talk about, but I'll talk about that office later, what we're doing right now. And when I went back to NOAA, when the administration transitioned, I moved over to NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. And this is a super cool office. I'm technically still an employee there, so I'm on a rotation to the White House. So this is still my day job, even though I don't spend a lot of time on this right now. So if you hear me talk about it in the present tense, it's because I still work there. But my day job is leading the National Coastal Zone Management Program, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. This office also has the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, which is great because I love the reserves and I work there, so it's fun to form partnerships with them. We also have a coral reef conservation program, and I care deeply about corals because of my experience. And then we have a really cool partnership called the Digital Coast that I'll show you in a sec. The National Coastal Zone Management Program was created by Congress in 1972 under the Coastal Zone Management Act, or CZMA. So happy 50th, very exciting. And, thinking back 50 years, this was like a lot of foresight went into this. So they understood the pressures on our nation's coasts. And they basically said, what do we want our coasts to be like in the future? Well, we care about having healthy coasts where people can live and recreate. We don't want our coasts to be so developed or so at risk that they're not enjoyable places to be anymore. And so they created this program, which is a partnership between NOAA and the states, where the states have to apply, and then they're managed as a state-federal partnership, and every program is unique. But again, these goals of preserve, protect, develop, and where possible, restore or enhance the resources of the nation's coastal zone. Does anyone know what the first state program was in the coastal zone management? Washington State, 1976. So, and here are the 34 states and territories that participate. It includes the Great Lakes states. And basically, it's every state and territory that's eligible except for Alaska. So anyway, they're all really different. They have different environments, different populations, and different priorities just based on where they are and the way that their state governments are run. Here are the goals of the CZMA. So you can see again, protect natural resources, provide public access. So if you're on the coast of Washington, you might see a coastal trail, and that trail might have a sign with a NOAA logo and a Washington Department of Ecology logo. That's probably funded through this program. So helping people get out to the coast and enjoy the coast. Or if you see a marsh or a dune that's being restored, that's probably or potentially being funded through this program. So these are annual grants to the states that are, the amount of money depends on the length of the coastline and the population. We have a formula, an Excel sheet, that's how much money you get, based on how much money Congress gives NOAA every year. And then the states develop 5-year assessments and strategies to guide their programs and sort of set the priorities. Like Washington has a lot of focus on coastal hazards. They have a lot of erosion and other issues, so they put a lot of emphasis on coastal hazards. And then the programs are evaluated on a regular basis. So what do I do? What's a day in life for me at the program? So I lead the program. I oversee things like reading the evaluations and checking on their assessments and strategies, helping with their grants and the formula. But I do, a lot of my work is I have a team of liaisons. So these are NOAA employees who live and work in the places where these programs are. So there's a NOAA liaison who lives in Guam, and she helps the Guam Coastal Management Program implement their program. Or I have a NOAA employee in Oregon, and she works with Oregon and Washington. So it's really great to have that close state-federal partnership where the people are working closely and living in the places that they serve. It's been a very successful model. And the Coastal States Organization is a non-governmental organization whose members are the state and territorial managers, so the heads of those programs. And we talk together all the time. What are your priorities? What are your challenges? What do you need from us? And similarly, they're what do you need from us? So it's a good back and forth. And then I also oversee coastal resilience grants, and that's a little bit more of an aside because it's not actually part of our program, but it's something that Congress gave us that because I had experience in that, I helped administer. So I just mentioned Congress gave us money in 2018 to create a new partnership between NOAA and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And this is a competitive grants program, so any community or university or whatever can apply to this program. And the grants support the design and implementation of habitat restoration projects that have community resilience benefits. So a slam dunk project is restoring a coastal marsh to protect a critical evacuation route or a power plant or something like that. So it has to not just have fish and wildlife benefits, but also direct benefits to the community. And this is an annual competition that's historically been at about $30 million a year of funding in projects all over the United States. And then Congress also sometimes throws money in after there's a disaster to help with recovery using nature-based solutions, because we've seen that things like seawalls sometimes give a false sense of security. And don't always hold up so well versus nature-based, or they also just only have certain benefits versus a nature-based project which might have multiple benefits. So anyway, Congress really likes this program. This picture is in Puerto Rico. They're doing a dune restoration project after Hurricane Maria, where they're kind of putting these stakes in and then making the dunes form in a way that's really conducive to habitat and buffering from waves. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, this program got almost $500 million. So for this program, that's a huge deal, right? It's been what we thought at NOAA was a big program, and now it's a really big program. And that's awesome because that means that we can put a lot more money out the door and do a lot more work in real places. I mentioned Digital Coast. So the NOAA Office for Coastal Management oversees a partnership. And if you either work on the coast or are from the coast or have people that you know who live or work on the coast, I would highly recommend checking out some of these resources because it has tools and trainings and like all kinds of really cool visualizations. So you can do things like put your county courthouse in and see where the sea level is going to be, on the steps. And so you can like bring that to a town meeting. Very impactful, very science-based tool that really brings home kind of coastal risk in a way that's visual and tangible. People really love this. So we have like a sea level rise viewer and a cool marsh migration tool that shows you where marshes might move under different sea level rise scenarios. And that can help you with maybe land acquisition or whatever so that you allow marshes to move in the future. Okay, so pivoting to my job right now. So I work at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And again, I'm on it's called a detail. It's like a loan from NOAA to the White House for a while to help implement climate and environmental priorities. So these are some of the top priorities for the Biden-Harris administration. And these are like all really big, really challenging issues. I personally work most on climate and environment, but I have colleagues who are working on some of these other issues as well. Quick PSA, we have a paid internship program. So this is the first administration to have a paid internship program, and it's awesome, and it actually pays pretty well. So if you're interested or you know others who might be interested, there's more information at this link. I think we just closed for spring applications, but I think December is when the summer applications will go live. And those aren't just to work in my office, that's to work in like 20 different offices across the White House. Okay, so where I work now, our office provides science advice to the president and advances key science, technology, and policy issues. So we work on everything from pandemic preparedness to artificial intelligence to data access information, open access policies for journals to climate change. And so that's pretty cool. We have a team of about 150 people who work on like a huge diversity of science challenges. And being a nerd, I really, really like to nerd out on like all of those different issues. So our team is led by Dr. Jane Lubchenko, who's from Oregon State University on loan to the White House. I serve as her chief of staff. So that means that I work with our team of about 25 people on a daily basis to help them do all of these things that are hard. And this includes people who've like never been in government and show up at the White House, and I help them figure out how to do that effectively. So I resolve conflicts, I help people go from an idea to actually like getting something done. I work a lot with other parts of the White House and other federal agencies on some of these issues. And this is just a flavor of the types of work that we do. Again, I work mostly on climate adaptation and resilience because that's kind of where I grew up through government. So this administration is taking climate change very seriously. Since day one, it's been a priority. President Biden signed an executive order, 14008, that laid out a set of ambitious actions to both reduce emissions and enhance the resilience of this country to climate change. He created a national climate task force and a national climate advisor. And there's been a ton of work happening ever since then. This is a website where you can like look up more of the information if you care about the details of what we're doing. I just wanted to share that as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the federal climate resilience landscape. What are we doing to prepare for the impacts of the United States of climate change on the United States? We're integrating resilience into federal agency efforts. We're providing funding and incentives. We're addressing current and emerging climate-related hazards on a hazard-by-hazard basis. And we're advancing usable science to inform adaptation and resilience decisions. We have a lot of science that the federal government collects. Not all of it is usable by regular people. And so platforms like Digital Coast and others are trying to like empower Americans to be able to more easily access and use climate information to support their decision making. So under the kind of federal leadership, some of the things that we're doing are the president signed in this executive order, he required every federal agency in the government to have a climate action plan. And this includes a lot of focus on resilience. So whether you're the US Postal Service, you need to be resilient to climate change. or if you're the General Services Administration, which is one of the largest owners of property in the United States, or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where you're working on affordable housing. So all of these agencies, I think there's like 30 of these, have developed climate action plans. Those are available online. And there's now been like 1-year progress reports that were just released earlier in October, where you can see some of the work that they're doing. The federal government is also making major investments, thanks to Congress, in resilience through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, like I mentioned with the Coastal Resilience Fund. And we're integrating resilience as a focus of White House environmental justice efforts, including Justice 40, which is a commitment of the administration for certain programs to ensure that at least 40% of the investments flow to underserved communities. The National Climate Task Force that I mentioned that the president created has a bunch of working groups that bring together a diversity of federal agencies to tackle some of these climate hazards. Wildfire, which I know you all can appreciate, is one of those. There's a coastal resilience group, and that includes a subgroup on community-driven relocation, because we're starting to see communities actually say, we want to move. This is not sustainable for us. And, you know, the federal government is like, okay, that's a tough ask, right? I mean, to just support a community in moving as a whole community is a really, really tough ask. And so how can we work together to support that community if that's what they've decided to do? We also have the group on extreme heat. That's the one that led to the pilot program you guys are participating in. One on drought, which continues to be a challenge, and one on flood. And the flood resilience group actually has a specific policy that they're implementing where all federal investments that are new or like significantly renovated in or near a floodplain now have to be built to incorporate future flood risk, not just past or current flood risk, future flood risk. That is a really big deal. Anyway, something that I was very involved in was a report that the president asked for on climate information and services. So, you know, we have weather services like the National Weather Service, but we need more climate services and information, actionable information. So I co-led a report on climate information and services that basically like laid out a vision for how the federal family could work better together to support advancing climate services that are usable for the American public. And there was a companion report on geospatial data and mapping tools. And now these reports are being implemented by federal agencies. This is also an important opportunity for partnership with universities and state governments and local communities, right? Like the federal government is not the only owner of climate information, and our climate information is much more useful when it's locally relevant. So anyway, it's a good opportunity for partnership. We also updated sea level rise information. So there's new sea level rise projections for the United States all the way out to 2150 for US coastal waters. And the new projections have been integrated into the Digital Coast platform so that you can more easily visualize updated sea level risk information for communities across the country. One of the programs that really works on this climate information, global climate information, national and actionable climate information, is called the US Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. This falls under our office as well. And this was also very forward-looking. So in 1990, Congress signed the Global Change Research Act saying, we need more global change science, global change is a crisis. And so they brought together these 13 federal agencies into an office to help advance understanding, assessment, prediction, and response to global change. So this program coordinates research across the 13 agencies. It informs decisions. We oversee the National Climate Assessment, and it also supports international climate science efforts like the IPCC. I am super jazzed about what we're doing with the National Climate Assessment. So we are kind of in the middle of the 5th National Climate Assessment process. We expect the report to get spit out next winter at some point. And we are trying to make this like the most inclusive, representative, sort of boldest assessment to date. We have something like 500 authors from all 50 states and a number of territories. And we've been doing a lot of engagement to try to make this more interactive and more real for Americans. So some of what we've been doing, we've had a lot of public comment and input, much more than we've ever had for other national climate assessments, especially early in the process. Like the public commented on the draft prospectus for this document. So from day one, we've sort of said, what do you want to see out of this assessment? And that's a really, we're trying to flip the model from just like throwing something over the transom and hoping that it's useful to co-producing something and making sure that we get input early in a process. We have author teams. We've done over 34 workshops. We've done youth workshops. We've done a lot of engagement. We've had thousands of people participate already. I am also really excited that last week we issued a call for art. So if you know any, I know Betsy, your daughter is not quite 13, but if you know any artists who are either 13 to 18 or any adults, you or others, friends, family, we have a challenge open through challenge.gov for the National Climate Assessment, art submissions related to climate change, and we'll be actually selecting from those submissions for inclusion in the assessment, which is really cool. We are also doing a public comment on our third order draft, and that will open in just a few weeks. So I know I keep throwing like public comment processes at you, but partly that's because they're really good exercise. You guys, you all can comment on anything that we're doing at any time that goes out for public comment, and it's a really great opportunity for you to have an impact and also to familiarize yourself with the policies and the products of the US government. So President Biden has also recognized the benefits that nature can provide people and why nature is good for tackling the climate crisis. So on Earth Day, he came to Seward Park in Seattle, and these are like Washington leaders. You may recognize some. I think Governor Inslee's head is cut off because he's too tall. But he signed an executive order that launched the first ever U.S. National Nature Assessment. Our office is leading that as well. So this is a companion to the National Climate Assessment focused on nature. How is nature changing in the United States? What is the status and trends across regions and sectors? Because we haven't really done that comprehensively to date, and that's a big opportunity. We're also working on a report on nature-based solutions. So like I talked about, things like restoring marshes to provide buffering to coastal environments, and that will be coming out soon as well. We're also developing a strategy for what's called natural capital accounting. Basically, that's like, how can we do a better job of measuring the benefits that we get from nature and putting that information in ways that make sense with our economic measures? Because right now, a lot of nature is undervalued because we simply don't measure or apply similar value structures to nature. So that's out right now, and if anyone wants to comment, they can for the next few days. We also have an effort called America the Beautiful. This is a goal to conserve or restore 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030. So these are just some ways that we're advancing nature that are relevant to our work on climate. We're also doing work on racial equity. So we have this White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council. I mentioned Justice 40. We have a climate and economic justice screening tool that's been released in beta version to help visualize challenges and opportunities associated with climate and justice. I was talking to people earlier today in the halls of the biology department about this effort we're doing on indigenous knowledge. So I was grateful for the acknowledgement at the introduction of this talk of the history of the Spokane tribe and the relationship with the university. We are going to issue guidance to all federal agencies on how to elevate indigenous knowledge in federal decision-making, which has never existed before. We're doing a lot of work in the Arctic with Native communities there and really including them in a co-production sort of way to understand, working with their indigenous and traditional knowledge, how we can better manage those environments. And then we're rolling up our sleeves on kind of like not super sexy, but really important stuff around equity and things like disaster relief policy. So there have been, historic barriers in some cases, for example, associated with proof of home ownership or challenges for renters in the face of disasters. And so FEMA, for example, is working on their individual assistance policies. And they're doing things like expanding forms of documentation that are, count for proving ownership or occupancy for homeowners and renters, and that's increasing the number of people who can benefit from these programs in a more equitable way. I mentioned the money flowing from Congress. I'm just going to put some dollar numbers on it because it's like truly astounding. So $47 billion for climate resilience in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Here are some of the programs that have gotten really big increases, including $7 billion for transportation, money at Interior for tribal climate resilience and community relocation, $3.5 billion at FEMA for flood mitigation, and the money that I mentioned at NOAA for the Coastal Resilience Fund. And as if that weren't enough, there were almost $370 billion in climate funding in the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is the largest piece of climate legislation in the history of the United States. Really big deal. Includes $45 billion for nature-based solutions and $60 billion for environmental justice priorities. The Coastal Zone Management Program and a couple of other programs at NOAA just got $2.6 billion. So at NOAA, historically, the annual budget has been like $4 to $5 billion. So that like just puts in scale what a huge investment opportunity this is. And I'm really excited about it because it's game-changing. $21 billion to ag to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, which is a hugely important sector for addressing the climate crisis. More money for tribes, more money for relocation at Department of the Interior, and almost $1 billion at Housing and Urban Development for improving the climate resilience of affordable housing. So looking ahead to what I hope is a more resilient future, we're really working to try to ensure that federal government programs and investments are themselves resilient to climate change because we're a large landowner, we have a lot of infrastructure, and we have a lot of responsibility over the safety and lives of American people. We're working to enhance the climate resilience of infrastructure and ecosystems, provide Americans with accessible, usable climate science information, and importantly, taking action to reduce emissions, which I didn't talk about much today, but again, that's because I primarily work on resilience. But that is hugely important to limit what we need to adapt to in the future. So if any of this sounds like interesting and fun to you, and you're kind of like, well, how do I end up getting there? Just some unsolicited advice. I think you all are great here. You have a lot of opportunities to take classes in both science and policy. You're already offering a lot of classes in both science and policy. Having opportunities to hone your communication skills, including to audiences who are not experts on what you work on and what you study, giving community talks, finding other ways to more broadly engage. Providing input during public comment periods. I think I threw like 5 different things your way, so if you want to comment, you have a lot of opportunity to do so. On any federal report and policy, right? I mean, we answer to the American public, so that's really what we want to do, is hear from people about what they want to see. And then collaborating with managers and local officials on a project. So are you doing work at a community park? Well, then talk to the local government about that and try to see how you might even be able to make that project more useful, understand what they're trying to do with that space, and that might help shape your research. And similarly, conducting work that's of high relevance to the policy community, and then sharing those findings in formats that are usable by people who aren't scientists. Oops. I think it just got rid of my thank you slide, but. Okay, thank you for having me here. This is my email address if you want to reach out to me if we don't have a time to chat today. And then, just shout out to Dr. Bancroft for being such a great friend and for being one of the reasons that I'm here today. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. So while you're thinking of your questions, I forgot to mention at the beginning that if you're online at home, you can also email climatecenter@gonzaga.edu if you have a question, and I'll check my phone every now and then in case you have a question at home. I'd like to start us off if that's okay. So one of the things I was excited about your talk is the relationship between policymaking and science. And we have colleagues who are of the view that either you can be a scientist or you can do policy work. But if you want to do policy work, you have to turn in your AAAS credential, and you're no longer a scientist. How would you respond to that view?
That's a good question. I know people have different and strong opinions about this. I mean, people ask me or they'll say, but you're not a scientist anymore. I'm like, of course I'm a scientist. I was trained as a scientist. I will always be a scientist. I still understand scientific inquiry, scientific writing, reading scientific papers. But just because I'm not actively doing research, it doesn't mean that I'm not applying science on a daily basis. So, I think there are a lot of different models for that. There's people who work, for example, for the Forest Service who are actually doing, ecology, they're out in the field, and that's very relevant to the resources that they're managing. So they're doing science and policy at the same time every single day.
So you
And
don't
then
think it corrupts the process and that you're tainting the quality and the validity of the science that's generated by introducing policy interests?
No, I don't. I mean, I do think there could be situations, maybe if you had to make a morally fraught decision about getting funding from a specific company that had a specific agenda, that might be one thing, but not in this sort of landscape.
All right, so anybody, especially students, to maybe start us off, do you have a question for Dr. Pettis? Good opportunity, lots of cool opportunities here. Anybody with a question out of the gate? Shy Gonzaga students, I'm not sure what that means. All right, very good.
Hi, hello, first of all, thank you so much for coming.
Sure.
I was wondering what the biggest difference is for you in terms of working in government, public communications, science, versus your sort of grad school work, your science work. Why did you pursue this, and what led you here, aside from you got this fellowship, which is wonderful, but I guess what drove you in that direction? What need did you have?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, honestly, I like both worlds, and I still struggle with that sometimes. I mean, I think when I was in academia, especially in graduate school, I kind of started big, and then I got deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into a line of inquiry, and I go really deep down that rabbit hole. And actually, that is super fun. So you start learning about a certain system, and then you make more observations, and then you follow that, you follow that, you follow that, you follow that. And I think I just wanted to zoom out for a second, kind of take a step back, put that work in context, especially with the oyster stuff, right? I was following this line of inquiry, and then I was wait a minute, what's happening right here, And so I think to me the biggest difference is the scale at which you're sort of applying questions. So I used to kind of start up and look down, and now I'm kind of looking up a lot more or out a lot more for connections. I mean, I think the challenge with that is that I can't go deep on anything ever, and I miss that because it's really fun and important to do. And we learn a lot through doing that then is important to zoom out and apply later. So we need both, and it's great that we have people in society who are doing all of the above. That continues to be a need. So yeah, that's one difference.
Hi, I'm Henry. I'm a freshman and I'm undeclared at the moment, but I want to get into policy, but also some environmental studies. Is there a pathway that you took or someone else that kind of was undeclared and wanted to go into policy and environmental studies at the same time?
Cool. I mean, honestly, you have some great people in the audience. If anyone wants to make a PSA for any Gonzaga programs, feel free to take the mic and do so, because I have been hearing a little bit today about both kind of the environmental studies program and the environmental sciences program, which is new. And it sounds like there's great opportunities to do either or both of those paths. For me, I didn't know that I wanted to do this stuff until much later. I would say that I took a class in graduate school in marine policy that was awesome. I mean, look for good professors who are really engaging and who understand how to apply information in the real world. So this class, they would have us get up and pretend that we were testifying in front of Congress. And the professors were super mean to us. And it was really intimidating and really informative and very realistic. If you watch a congressional hearing, that is what it is like. And so people either really thrived or totally freaked out and didn't want to do that ever again. And I was that was fun. Writing briefing memos on an actual issue that's really happening, or providing public comment on something that's really happening. And again, just less theoretical, more real world, I think, and how your brain works. And I think depending on for me, it's been useful to have a science training because I'm now in a science office, but you can come at that from any, you could go to law school and come at it that way. You could do, straight policy, but then do science policy. Like there's no linear or singular path, which I think is good because, I don't know, life is always kind of, meandering anyway, but like there's a lot of there's no right or wrong way to do that. But if anyone wants to talk about the Gonzaga opportunities, okay.
You handled it surprisingly well, so thank you for that.
Hi, can you comment on how the natural capital accounting strategy might influence GDP?
Now, this makes me laugh because the economist who's leading that effort is like, GDP is an imperfect measure of, he's very like, but the whole point is GDP does not capture that. And ideally what you want are measures that do. So, I don't think that GDP is going to like go away. Like he might want it to. But anyway, I think that what...
Do you want to repeat the question just so everybody's on the same
Sure.
page?
So the question was how the natural capital accounting strategy might affect GDP. And I think ideally you want economic measures like GDP that better reflect nature. So I don't know that they're going to like fundamentally, I think in an ideal world you could just replace GDP with a better measure that actually better reflects the value of nature. And or you can have these other measures be what is looked to and communicated about to the American public about, the benefits that we provide or the trade-offs that we have, understanding the relationships between nature, people, and the economy in a more holistic way. But I would encourage you to check out the strategy because they talk about GDP. That group talks about GDP.
We have a question from someone on the live stream. Renata Collins asks, what are some ways the federal government can work directly with local governments on climate solutions? So how might the federal government help work with Spokane city government on climate solutions, for example?
Yeah, we've had some really good partnerships with local government. I think, the challenge is actually what we're experiencing, for example, at NOAA, is we have more demand than we have the ability to like individually serve certain communities. Because the best relationships are those that are sustained through time, where there can be iteration between the community members and, whoever's providing information. So what I think has worked really well is, for example, we've worked with Broward County, Florida, on sea level rise and flooding, and Charleston, South Carolina. There have been municipalities that were kind of early to the game and like, ding dong, NOAA, come help us out with this. And then you can really sit down with that community and talk through the risks that they're facing with people who work for that community's government. And then, often they have science that's super useful that makes the national level or regional level information even better. And you can marry that up to have best available science for that place. And again, kind of understand from their perspective, they can visualize like what happens during high tide flooding, what streets and neighborhoods are at risk. And so, there is a lot of that. I would just say the challenge is like, it's hard to tailor information and serve every single community when you're an agency like NOAA. It's just really hard. That would be great if we could.
Okay. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. I had a question. So the OSTP, you do a lot of things, resiliency work, and you cover a lot of ground. And you mentioned you don't really focus specifically in reducing carbon emissions in your work, but I'm curious what your office does sort of in that realm, because I'm sure it's a big part of what you do, but not your background.
Yeah, we have, so I'm on the climate environment team. We actually have a separate energy team, and they really lead a lot of that work. So work around net zero. They had the White House Fusion Summit. They're doing a lot. They're going to the COP27 meeting in Egypt. That's the big convention of the parties. And so there's a lot of work both at OSTP and other parts of the White House. We have a new office of, I can't remember the name because it was just created like 3 weeks ago, but Clean Energy Innovation and Implementation or something that John Podesta is running. So he's someone who has a huge amount of political and climate experience. And so it really is like an all hands on deck effort to, the Inflation Reduction Act also, huge amounts of money for clean energy and renewable energy technology. So that, again, will radically change our transportation infrastructure, the vehicles we drive, the materials that we use in construction, uptake of solar and wind. And I know on the ocean side, there's a lot of action underway around offshore wind, and in Oregon they're doing offshore wave too. Maybe in Washington, I haven't been keeping up on that. Awesome. So anyway, there is a lot happening, and Department of Energy has been doing a ton.
Hi, I'm Larry. Obviously not a Gonzaga student, but I'll raise a question. I'm really impressed with the career you've had. It must be very satisfying to see all of these things that you've had an impact on. And I'm sitting here wondering how you would respond to, there are environmental groups out there who look at the Infrastructure Act and the IRA, and they say, wow, really well done, not enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I agree, right? Like, I think probably a lot of us feel this way, where it's hard when, you really feel like every day you do everything you can, and then you also worry that it's not enough. And so, I think, but I don't think it's super helpful to like either give up, that's not gonna help, or just to be angry all the time, that's not gonna help. It's okay to be a little bit angry, right? Like it's justified to be a little bit angry or critical that this is not enough, because there needs to be more. And so I think, ideally we'll have continued really aggressive action across administrations and at all levels of government and outside of government. In addition to, the resources that are needed from Congress. I think what's really exciting this time is, for the first time in recent history, we actually have some resources from Congress. Not that we didn't have any before, but this is like game-changing resources. And so that will rapidly increase the scale of uptake of some of what we've been trying to do for a really, really long time.
Do you have like a short answer on how to avoid having the perfect be the enemy of the good, which seems like a version of Larry's question, right? When you're looking for perfect legislation and you're saying this isn't good enough, they're saying actually you should vote against it because it's not perfect or not good enough.
Yeah,
I
and I
assume
guess
you
if the
wouldn't agree with that.
alternative is like not having anything, right? I
Right.
mean, and it's good that like there's bipartisan compromise and back and forth, and it makes sense that industries and the economies of different states, and anyway.
Hi, my name's Grant. I just have a quick question. So you were talking about the oysters and all of the collapse of the infrastructure there and how that can be really devastating to people who are a part of it. How do you approach coworkers, colleagues, or anything along that line who feel like they get really stuck in that rut and see things like that and go, oh, there really is no hope, or we really don't have a chance here? How do you approach that when talking to other people?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's okay to have days like that, right? Like we all do. But I think that it just like kind of throwing in the towel is just, at least to me, not an acceptable choice. And even in Apalachicola, so for example, what they've been doing recently more of is, because these are people whose livelihoods depend on the seafood industry, they've been doing things like packaging oysters from Louisiana. So they've still been doing some packaging, which keeps jobs and helps, the infrastructure there helps it stay a seafood town, which is really important to the cultural identity of that place. They've been doing a big initiative. FSU just got a big grant to try different methods of bringing back the oysters. And so there's scientists working with harvesters who I believe are getting paid to be part of this. And they're dabbling with some aquaculture. I mean, because at this point, anything is better than nothing probably in that community. And then they're creating, it's always been a little bit of like a boutique tourist town, but there's some rebranding happening, and they're continuing to find ways to, acknowledge and celebrate the history, even if that resource isn't as vibrant as it used to be. So, again, there's no choice but to like persevere. And so it's been interesting watching that one place and how they're doing that. And I don't think there's like the perfect solution anywhere, but that's just an example of what's happening down there.
Hi. It was really exciting hearing about all of this and what the new administration is doing, the current administration. But I was just wondering, like, how easy is that, are like some of the executive orders like going to be to overturn when a new administration comes in that doesn't prioritize these issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. And honestly, a lot of what I worked on in the Obama administration was rescinded on one particular day in the Trump administration, and I left early that day because it was years and years of work. So executive orders can easily be overturned. That being said, a lot of the things that we're doing, like, you know, reports or strategies or whatever, we're bringing agencies together around that, and they're already starting to implement, or it's already building off work that they would be doing anyway. And so there's like some embedding and mainstreaming of stuff happening. It's not all about, you know, one administration to another, and there are things that continue to carry forward. And I think having public engagement and support for the work, you know, and just hearing about the need for that type of work is really powerful. And again, partnerships with those outside of government help to strengthen anything that we're doing. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Hadley. Thank you so much for being here. Have you found a lot of space for teaching, especially to our legislators, being a big part of your role here?
Teaching and educating legislators. So I myself, well, sometimes. So oftentimes the Hill will ask us to do briefings. For example, I have someone on my team who works on PFAS chemicals, like forever chemicals in the environment. And so she just did a congressional briefing on PFAS because they were really interested in doing that and maybe even legislating about it. So often if Congress is thinking about making a law, they'll come talk to our office if it's a science topic. And so then we do have the opportunity to like educate. I participated in a climate science day on the Hill one year at NOAA. And I got to talk to a representative from Oregon during her first few months in office. And I got to explain hypoxia, the dead zones that were happening off the Oregon coast due to changes in oceanic circulation and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to nerd out on that. But the point is, she hadn't heard about it and was like, wait a minute, what? You know, and so I was explaining what that meant and what was happening in the crab fishery and what we were learning about it. And then like the next week, she talked about it in a floor speech. So, you know, there really can be a lot of opportunity for education. And I think my attitude is like, I'm happy to educate anyone who wants to talk about any of this anytime, right? And I think most people that I know are similar, so yeah.
I think that's a pretty good place to end. Let's thank Dr. Pettish one more time. So I just wanted to remind you that we do have several more events coming up for the Climate Center this semester. These two will both be on Zoom. And so I encourage you to go and register for these and take advantage of these amazing speakers that the Climate Center hosts. Gonzaga created this project in order to try and make a better use of the university in learning about, understanding, and responding to climate change. And so all of you being here tonight makes a difference. Participating in things like the heat study and trying to help understand perceptions and experiences of extreme heat in our community will make a real difference so that next time we have an extreme heat wave, we don't have 20 community members dying. We can actually prepare and plan so that our community can become resilient and benefit from the projects that NOAA and our federal government is sponsoring by all of us participating in that. Pursuing lines of education where you can actually try and make a difference. This is a great example of how you can pursue your interests and you can actually really make a big difference in the world. So thank you all for being here tonight. I hope to see you at a future event. Thank you.